Well, hi there. I'm Joan Biediger, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I want to try something a little different today. This episode is about perception, miniature painting, building, and about the simple problem that we don't always see our own work as clearly as we think we do. Many of us spend a lot of time at the bench assuming familiarity equals precision. We've looked at the piece for hours, maybe days, maybe weeks. We know where the highlights are, which transition still bothers us, what the face is doing. We feel like we know the piece, or at least we think we do. But one of the strange things about making miniatures is that the closer and longer we look, the easier it can become to stop really seeing. This happens because perception is selective. Attention gets tired, and familiarity has a way of smoothing over things we would notice instantly in somebody else's work. Psychology tells us that attention is limited. We miss things in plain sight. We adapt to what we've been staring at. We become less responsive to information that stays in front of us too long. In ordinary life, that can mean not noticing where you left your keys, or overlooking a detail in a room you walk through every day. At the bench, it can mean something more specific. It can mean that you stop seeing what the viewer will actually notice and start seeing the version you expect to be there. That gap is what I want to look at, because I think many of us have had the experience of working hard on a piece, feeling fairly sure we understand it, and then having some odd little jolt of surprise when we photograph it or step back or put it under different light, or even show it to someone else. Suddenly, the piece is not quite the piece we thought we knew. Maybe the face is weaker than we thought, or stronger. The contrast is harsher or flatter. Something we labored over for an hour disappears completely. Something we barely thought about becomes the first thing the eye sees. Those moments are irritating, but they tell you something. And if you stay with that for a second, it raises a more uncomfortable possibility. It may not just be that the piece looks different under new conditions. It may be that while you were working, you were responding to a version of the piece that only exists at your work table. A version shaped by how close you are, how long you've been looking, and what you expect to see next. And that version is not always the one the viewer gets. So today I want to turn that into an exercise. If you're somewhere you can safely do this, you can follow along with one of your own miniatures. If not, you can listen through now and come back later. Either way, the idea is simple. I want to test what happens when you stop looking at your piece in the usual way. Because I think some of us are painting one piece at the bench and discovering later that the viewer is seeing something slightly different. If you want to do the exercise with me, go ahead and grab one finished miniature, your phone, and a place where you can step back a few feet. Don't choose a problem piece. Choose something that's typical of your work. The goal is not to confirm what you already suspect. It's to notice what you did not expect. You don't need special lighting. Ordinary conditions are better for this. Most miniatures spend their lives being seen under a mix of ordinary conditions anyway. I mean, they get looked at on a shelf, on a table at a show, through a phone screen. That is all part of their reality. The point is not to judge the piece, it's to notice how differently it behaves when the conditions change. And once you see that, you can use it. Let's start with the most familiar view. Hold the miniature at your normal working distance, however far away you usually study your work while painting or sculpting or building. Use that distance now. Take a few seconds and just look. If you need to pause here, go ahead. Now answer a simple question. Where did your eye go first? Not where you think it ought to go. Where did it actually go? Then ask, where did it stay? What area kept drawing you back? What did you mostly ignore? This matters because attention is not evenly distributed. The eye is drawn to certain areas based on contrast and structure. That happens quickly and often before you're even aware of it. At your workbench, though, we often do something very different. We move around the piece locally. A strap, then a cuff, then the cheek, then the base, then back to the sleeve. We know the sequence of effort. That sequence starts to feel like how the piece is seen, but they are not always the same thing. The fact that you spent 40 minutes on the left sleeve does not mean the left sleeve matters perceptually. The fact that you consider the face the focus does not necessarily mean the eye agrees. Some areas attract attention immediately. Others do very little, even if they are very carefully painted or sculpted. Just note that. Now change the conditions. Put the miniature down and step back 2 to 4 feet. This is not a lab. Just move far enough away that you're no longer in close inspection mode. Look again. Give it a few seconds. Now ask yourself, what disappeared? What matters less now than it did close up? What became more important? Does the overall light and dark pattern read more clearly? Does the pose carry the piece? Does the face still hold? Does anything feel flatter or less organized? Research on visual processing shows that fine detail becomes less visible with distance, while larger value relationships and shapes become more important. You can see that directly here. A piece that feels detailed up close can lose structure when you step back. Another piece can gain clarity because the larger organization becomes easier to read once the smaller information drops away. The piece invites close inspection, but it also has to function as a whole before the inspection happens. Sometimes what feels rich at several inches turns to mush at 3 feet. Sometimes what felt a little plain close up suddenly looks more unified and convincing from farther back. Sometimes an area you spent a lot of time refining turns out not to matter much at all because the larger value structure is doing the real work. Sometimes the opposite happens and you realize the larger structure is weak and the piece has been coasting on close-up charm. That's useful to know. Not because every piece must perform equally at every distance. I don't think that's true, and I don't think it would even be desirable. But it does matter whether the way the piece changes is something you understand and accept, or something that catches you off guard. Now, take a quick photo with your phone. Look at the piece through the screen. Zoom in a little, move around the image. Look at the face if it's a figure. Look at transitions. Look at whatever you tend to care about most in your own work. And now ask the question again. What changed? You may see harsher transitions, stronger edges, more visible texture, or you may find that something reads better than it did in your hand. A phone image is not a neutral record. Cameras sharpen and compress. They exaggerate certain features, but the phone view still matters. Miniatures are often seen this way now. That is part of how the work is experienced. So treat it as another condition, not a final judgment. Now ask the most important question. What surprised you? That moment of surprise is useful because it marks the point where your expectation did not match what you actually saw. Did something you thought was important turn out to be weak? Where did your eye go first this time? What no longer reads? That surprise is the real point of the experiment. And that is where the useful information lives. What this exercise demonstrates is straightforward. Your miniature does not exist as one fixed visual experience. It has a close range version, a distance version, and a screen version. Those are not identical. The close range version is dominated by small decisions, edges, blends, small details, surface control. The distance version depends more on structure, value relationships, overall organization. The screen version introduces its own distortions. Edges get sharper, contrast can jump, color can shift. Texture can become more visible. None of these is the whole truth, but each one is real, and the piece is doing more than one job at once. If you only account for one of those conditions while working, the others can produce results you didn't anticipate. There's another factor here. The longer you look at your work, the easier it becomes to overlook parts of it. This is a well-known effect in perception. Repeated exposure reduces sensitivity. You stop registering certain details with the same clarity. At your workbench, that means you can become very confident in a version of the piece that depends on familiarity. That's why artists use simple methods to reset their vision. They step back, they photograph the work, they change the lighting, they look at it later, they look in mirrors, they turn work upside down, they just interrupt familiarity. They let the eye meet the thing a little less automatically. Those methods don't change the piece, they change how it's seen. When you know a piece that intimately while making it, it's hard to see it the way a viewer would. And resetting your vision is part of what this exercise is trying to show you. Seeing the piece this way changes the question a little. It's no longer just about what is visible up close, it's about what still holds up when the viewer is further away and some of the detail drops out. Miniatures invite close looking. That is part of what they're built for. People lean in, they inspect, they start noticing brushwork, texture, and all the smaller calls you made. But miniatures also have to function before that. They should survive the glance, the step back, the imperfect photograph, the memory afterward. And not every decision survives equally well. Let's try a few more small tests. The point is simply to notice which parts of the piece are carrying more than you thought and which parts may depend too much on close inspection. Place the miniature a few feet away again. Soften your vision, lightly squint or take off your glasses if you wear them. Look for a few seconds. What still reads? What disappears first? Where does your eye still land? When detail is reduced, larger value relationships become more visible. That's why this works. If the piece still has a clear structure, the eye will find it. If not, it will feel scattered or unclear. Artists have been using some version of this for a long time. When detail drops away, the larger relationships become easier to see. This can be very revealing in miniature work. Sometimes the face still holds beautifully even when the tiny eye detail is mostly gone, because the surrounding structure is doing enough to support it. Sometimes the face weakens immediately, which tells you it may have been relying on very local information more than you realized. Sometimes a secondary area starts stealing focus because its contrast is simply too strong. Sometimes the whole thing turns into one muddy shape. None of that is fun exactly, but it is useful. The question is not whether the piece remains fully readable under squinting. Of course, some things will disappear. The question is whether enough of the internal order survives that the eye still knows how to move through the work. If the answer is yes, then the structure is probably doing more of the work than you realized. If the answer is no, then more of the piece may depend on detail than you thought. Now let's reduce it even further. Think of a silhouette. Hold the miniature at arm's length in front of a lamp or a window. Ignore surface detail as much as possible and concentrate on the outline. Does the pose read? Is the structure clear? Does the arrangement of forms make sense? Early on, the eye is mostly reading shape and edge. In miniature work, this means that the underlying structure carries a lot of weight, often before any detail is noticed. This matters because before we admire surface, we usually register form. We respond quickly to contour, to direction, to the basic architecture of the object. A bent head, a reaching arm, a tilt in the torso, the angle of a doorway. the relationship between two forms in space. Those things begin working very early, long before every small painted refinement has had a chance to plead its case. Now I want to try one more reduction, and this one is a little different. Look at the miniature for 5 seconds, then look away. What do you remember? Was it the face? The pose? A strong light area? Atmosphere? What remained once the piece was no longer in front of you? This is interesting because at this point we move from perception into memory, and those are not quite the same thing. We do not carry away an exact inventory of what we saw. Usually we carry away a compressed impression, a few relationships, a few emphatic features, a sense of where the eye went and what kind of feeling the piece left behind. People experience the work in the moment, then they walk away, and later they remember it. Across these tests, certain things often persist. Large value relationships, clear silhouettes, strong directional gestures, and focused contrast. Smaller refinements tend to disappear unless they're connected to those larger structures. That doesn't make them unimportant. They matter for close inspection, but they do not all contribute equally to how the piece holds together under different conditions. Not every decision contributes equally to how the piece survives distance, reduction, and memory. It's easy to interpret this as a need for stronger contrast or more emphasis. Sometimes that is correct, but often the issue is not intensity, it's organization. If the parts of the piece compete with each other, the result feels unstable. If they support each other, the piece holds together more easily. That is not about making everything louder, it's about making the structure clearer. That's a more useful problem than just pushing contrast, and usually a more useful one to solve. Because some strong pieces are not necessarily the loudest, they're the ones where the choices reinforce one another. They know what matters. They know what can stay quieter. They know how to let the viewer in without making every surface yell for attention. One reason I think all of this matters so much in miniatures is that miniature work is always in some sense a compressed world. It takes a body, or a room, or a scene, or a machine, or a face, or some invented little reality, and makes it small enough to be held and examined, carried, or grasped in a more concentrated way than life itself usually allows. That compression means selection is never optional. You cannot preserve every quality equally. You can't have everything matter at the same level. Scale makes choices for you even before you begin. Then materials make more choices, and perception makes still more. In that sense, miniatures have something in common with maps, which is probably one reason I keep thinking this way. A map cannot contain everything. Scale forces decisions. Generalization is not a flaw in a map. It's built into the form. The challenge is to preserve what matters for the purpose at hand. Miniatures have a similar problem, not because they're maps, but because they too are selective constructions. They too have to decide what will carry, what will compress, what will be suggested instead of fully stated, what will survive attention, and what will disappear unless it's supported by something larger. And once you start thinking about miniatures that way, the question becomes a little larger than whether a blend is smooth enough or an edge highlight is too thick. Those things matter, yes, but underneath them is a more structural set of questions. What has to survive for this piece to still work? What does the eye keep coming back to? And what remains once the piece is no longer in your hands? Those to me are very miniature questions. So what do you actually do with all of this? The practical answer is fairly modest. Every so often while you're working, interrupt the close-up trance. Not constantly, not in a way that makes painting, sculpting, or building miserable. Just occasionally. Step back, squint, take the photo. Ask what still reads. Ask what disappears. Ask whether the thing you think is carrying the piece is actually carrying it. And maybe ask one other question. If someone remembers only one thing after seeing your piece, what is it likely to be? You may not always know the answer, but it is a useful question because it turns your attention away from endless local correction and back towards the larger life of the work. Not just does this area look right while I'm painting it, but also what happens to it when I step back? What happens to it when the detail drops away? What happens to it when someone else sees it under conditions I don't control? That is part of the life of the piece too. What I hope this leaves you with is not doubt, but awareness. The piece you're making is not seen in only one way. It changes with distance, it changes with attention, it changes with context, and some parts of it will carry through those changes better than others. If you try this, pay attention to what surprises you. Not what you already know, but what changed, what held, and what didn't behave the way you expected. And that's usually where the useful information is. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist, subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here. And I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. And before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. So keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and every so often look at it from somewhere else and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.